Hey everyone, welcome to our what we're calling kind of a TED Talk today. We're going to have a little bit of a talk on the idea of the Gospels. And Steve, you've already said that. We're trying to be 6 feet apart and all this kind of stuff and take care of each other during this. Before we even get started, I want to make sure and tell everyone that we hope you're well and we hope you're staying safe. This is Christmas time, and it's kind of a tough time of year not to have all the activities of the church, at least in person. We've got a lot of activities going on, but we know how much people miss the in-person stuff. We do a lot of teaching during Advent and all that kind of stuff, so we thought we would go ahead and try to do that today and share some of our thoughts on the Gospels and how very different they treat the Christmas story. I mean, we've got 4 Gospels, right? And I'll just go through, let me go through and just kind of give a tiny little synopsis, and we'll start our conversation. Our first gospel is Matthew. It's got a birth narrative, tells us all about the birth. Then we've got Mark. I'm trying to get them in order, right? Then we've got Mark, who has no birth narrative whatsoever. It's got what we call the birth narrative, none of that. It's got the entire, it starts off with John the Baptist. Then we've got Luke, that's got a big-time birth narrative that's a lot different from Matthew. And then we have John, which is a different kind of birth. It's actually the beginning of the world and creation and all of that kind of stuff. So that's really different. You hear about that on Christmas Day or the first Sunday after Christmas that we talk about that. And you'll hear more about that later. But I think today we kind of want to talk about Matthew and Luke because they both try to do the same thing, but they do it incredibly different.
Yeah, one of the things that has always impressed me was the reason for those Gospels, the purpose that they had in writing them. And
right.
Looking at that purpose, they were certainly writing to, those Gospels were written by different traditions, different groups of Christians. And I think one of the important things too to look at is those Gospels were probably written by second-generation Christians, and they were written from the oral traditions that were given down to them. It's always interesting for me to think Paul probably wrote all of his letters long before the Gospels were put together.
Yeah, the first book of the Old Testament, the oldest one, is actually Thessalonians. Which, we always think, oh, it's got to be Mark or something like that. No, it's Thessalonians. Go read it. It's a good read, but it's not what you expect to be first and the oldest thing, the first thing written down in the Christian canon.
But no, with the Gospels, and there's always been debate on, what was the first one written or what. And I guess a lot of people look at the Gospel of Mark as being the first one, and there's really not much about the birth of Christ in Mark.
Nothing. not a lot, nothing. That's kind of like the cliff notes of the gospel. We always talk about how brief and quick that one is. Jesus is always in a hurry. He's never been to our neck of the woods, obviously, where everything's pretty slow. He's kind of like a Manhattan Jesus. I mean, he's moving all the time, and everybody, come on, let's go, So that's Mark. But I mean, the difference is when we get birth narratives, we like to talk about, and we're going to say birth narratives because that's the way we were trained, kind of, to talk about that. But no, we're talking about the Christmas story, okay? But the birth narratives, there are 2 of them that are very much birth narratives in the traditional sense. There's Matthew and there's Luke. I was surprised today because I went back and I actually read them again because, you forget what you forget how much you don't remember, especially doing what we do. And I went through and I got some surprises, some things I never noticed before. Number one, we can talk a little bit about Matthew. Mary, the Blessed Virgin Mary, is mentioned by name 4 times in Matthew's account of the birth, of the Christmas story, the Nativity. Only 4 times. The star of the show, believe it or not, is Joseph in Matthew. And flabbergasted. I was like, what? You know, like, you know, because, well, you know, we honor the Blessed Virgin Mary quite a bit, but it was Joseph that was the star of the show in that.
You know, and actually, the gospel for this Sunday, the one that we read during noonday prayer from Luke, the story of the Annunciation, that's only in Luke.
Mm-hmm.
The Annunciation in Matthew is quite different. When Gabriel comes to Joseph,
Yeah,
and not
it's
to
Joseph.
Mary.
Annunciation.
But you know, we have to remember that the Gospel of Matthew was developed in a very Jewish tradition,
That's right.
and the purpose of Matthew was to show that connection to the chosen people, or the people of
Right.
Israel,
Right.
and that continuation of the Old Testament covenant being
Right.
fulfilled in Christ. And so it's a very
Well, there's one clue to that, you know, and it's kind of the most obvious clue. You know, when you open up Luke, it talks about the guy who wrote Luke and say, yeah, I know what I'm talking about, right? It's a very Greek thing to do, is to give your bona fides, what we would call them our bona fides, you know, before you start telling the story, you know, so people would believe that you weren't full of a lot of malarkey or making it up, right? Hunting stories and fishing stories should start out with bona fides, but anyway. Matthew starts out with something totally different. It's a genealogy. I mean, it's saying, okay, Abraham to David, then David to some arbitrary date that's about the Babylonian captivity when the Jews were sent into exile, and then 14 generations to Jesus. So it's a very famous 14. You've talked about that before with you know, at the churches that you've been to over the Holy Land. But it goes all the way to Jesus, and it's really important because it's got Abraham, David, and Jesus. And then the delivery from Babylonian captivity. So in other words, Jesus is another one of these deliverers in the Jewish tradition.
Yeah, he's presented as the fulfillment to all
Right.
those Old Testament
Right.
prophets.
Right. Another interesting thing about Matthew, because we can sit here all day and geek out on this, because this is that's what we do. Interesting thing is that after we get past the Joseph show, you know, like poor pitiful Joseph, and yeah, come on beer, you know, that kind of thing. Reminds me of a sitcom from the 50s or something like that, right? Then you get into what happens next, which takes up the massive amount of the birth narrative, which is the Magi. You know, the Magi, the wise men, we three kings, whatever you want to call it, you know. But that's important as well, because that was honor. If you're viewing Jesus as a king, who's going to come and visit?
The king.
The kings, right? And then Herod also tricks them by saying, I want to go honor him too. What king is going to go honor somebody born in their own place, unless it's, you know, something pretty spectacular? But of course, Herod was jealous and all that stuff, right? But, you know, that's a big deal.
Yeah. And, well, that takes it into the story, the slaughter of the holy innocents,
Right.
appearing only in that in the Gospel of Matthew.
Right.
It's presenting Jesus in that tradition of Moses.
Exactly. We've all seen the movie, right? Where they take Moses and put him in a little basket. And then they come through and slaughter the boys. And this is said to have happened in Matthew after Jesus was born. Now the Romans would have done this. And the Romans wrote down everything they did. If they drank a glass of water, it was documented. We don't really see that in history, but who's to say? It's there, it's important. Because if it's important for no other reason than to really point to Jesus as a deliverer, just like Moses, right? And that's important stuff. It's really important for us to mention, though, when we go through these kind of critically, right? You know, we look at them and we look at them with those eyes. We're not denigrating any of the Gospels. Everything that is in there is important. we're pointing out the interesting part so you can dive deeper into the Gospels and through that grow in your faith. All right, we're not trying to prove anything wrong or anything right. We're just pointing about what is actually there, and that is there. Right?
Again, they were written for different purposes.
Right. A long time ago, nobody was sitting there writing this thing down, going, "I bet Zondervan's going to publish a bunch of books in leather in the year 2020 with this stuff in it," you know. So with that all being said, let's look at Luke, which is just fascinating. Luke starts off with a bona fide, like we said, you know, like, "Hey, I was there. I was so and so and so and so. I knew what was happening. I was told by so and so that this happened." And then what happens? Well, he starts off with Zachariah and Elizabeth, right? And that whole, like, you're going to have to be quiet. The angel appears to them. Zachariah doesn't believe it, and then he shuts Zachariah up.
But we do get this wonderful song of Zachariah.
Yeah, and when he can talk again,
Yes.
after John the Baptist is born. So, of course, that's the birth of John the Baptist and talks about the Baptist, right? And then Elizabeth is pregnant. She's far advanced in years. God has done this many times with Sarah and all sorts of folks, you know, to have a very special birth of a prophet. And so she gives birth to John the Baptist, but not before she gets a visitation herself from Mary, which comes after the Annunciation of Mary, which is in Luke. Before we even talk about that a lot, excuse me, it's really important to point out that as Joseph was the star of the show and the Magi were the star of the show in Matthew, the star of the show in this is Jesus and Mary.
Yes.
Yeah. A nice supporting role by Joseph, but he's kind of in the end credits. He's, I don't even, you know, there you go.
Jesus is shown as the Savior to bring salvation to the world.
Right.
That's also true in Matthew, but it's also coming through the Old Testament.
Right.
Story there.
It's saving the world, and we're gonna, you know, yeah. It's not very. It doesn't feel very universal in this birth narrative of Matthew, but it is very universal in Luke. Starting out with the fact that Gabriel appears to Mary, whose famous words, "Do not be afraid," and she takes on the task. Joseph happens just a little bit. Like, yeah, Joseph is mentioned even less than Mary in Matthew. And then they go for the census, which is really important because it shows who's in charge. The Romans are in charge. And then they have no room in the inn. It's a manger. In Matthew, there's no manger. It's a house. They go to a house.
And it's 2 years later.
Yeah, you know, like it's not right. So, so in Luke, it's the manger. It's very humble. And then the angels come again and appear to who?
Well, the shepherds.
The shepherds. And they're not the creme of the crop like the Magi are the creme of the crop. They're kind of
They were about as low as you could get.
kind of like itinerant workers that we see, you know. I mean, they're no place to lay their head. They lived rough.
Out
They
in the
slept
fields,
rough. Yeah,
In the caves with the sheep.
exactly. It wasn't a job that you quit at 5 and put the sheep in the barn and went home. I mean, they were always out. And protecting was a dangerous job. They had to protect the sheep as well. So, yeah. So what we have is the shepherds, and then they get the news and they evangelize. And they're afraid as well. There's a lot of do not be afraid. But they go on for it. So, yeah.
You know, it is, though, the story in Luke, I think, that all of us associate with at Christmas time.
Right.
With the manger, the stable,
Right. Right.
the angel of the Lord appearing to the shepherds.
Right.
It's It's the beautiful story of Christmas.
Oh, it's a beautiful story of Christmas. But the reason we call this gospel soup, though, is because it was told to me by an old New Testament professor of mine, Kathy Grieve, who's just the Reverend Mother Kathy Grieve, who's just a wonderful mentor of myself and a lot of people in Virginia Theological. And she called it gospel soup, because that's what the pageants did. Pageants gave us all gospel soup. And for a lot of people out there, this is the church they get in the year. That's not a bad thing. We're blessed that people are getting church, you know. But they're getting gospel soup. You know, they're not getting like Matthew or Luke or whatever. So thus the name, gospel soup. And I think you're right. It's a little bit more of a Luke presentation, you know, except for those wise men that pop up. You know, we're always talking about the frankincense and myrrh, the gold, all that stuff. So yeah. So that's the birth narratives. One other thing about Luke, though, before we go, there is a genealogy. You have to remind me there was a genealogy, and it's much further back, you know, because this stuff turns into gospel soup in our brains as well, right? And so it's much further back, and I remembered it because it had a very different feel from Matthew's genealogy. It starts off with Jesus, but it goes back all the way to Adam. It's not just the Jewish Abraham. It goes son of Adam, Adam, son of God. So as much as we like to sometimes think Luke is a little bit more Gandhi superhero Jesus, a little bit more on the ground, actually the theology and the high Christology, which means your view of Jesus, you know, like how the Gospels depict Jesus, it's a lot higher than we think. Probably the stepping stone into John, you know, with that God.
I mentioned that, of course. The story of the Nativity in John is much, much different.
It's a big bang. Well, I like to call it the Big Bang Nativity. I mean, it starts off with the creation of the universe.
In the beginning was the Word.
It's actually, I don't want to sound like Ebenezer Scrooge, but that's actually my favorite birth narrative right there. It's John.
I think the prologue to John's Gospel is probably one of the most beautifully written parts.
Oh yeah, it's fantastic. So tune in on the first Sunday after Christmas, which is only one day after Christmas, one or two, something like that. And you'll get to hear a lot more about that gospel. But there you go. So anyways, anything you want to add? I don't want to take this whole thing up.
Well, at this time during Advent, it's always a busy and a hectic time.
Yeah.
And I enjoy that, the Christmas preparation. But I hope that with what we've talked about today and the difference in the Gospels, that take a few minutes, some quiet time, and read those different birth narratives, particularly with Matthew and particularly in Luke.
And just to tell you how long it took, I mean, in preparation for this today, how busy we've been, I was like, oh, I gotta talk intelligently about something today. I read them both in 30 minutes and actually made notes and stuff like that. So it's just a nice little devotional thing you can think about doing, which I really recommend during this time of oddness.
It is. It's a different and difficult Advent season. And what a wonderful thing to do, to sit down with the Gospels for 30 minutes and read them and then let God speak to you about them.
With that being said, we hope that people have found this to be fun. You know, we're doing Facebook Live right now. It will also be available later on YouTube. This is going to be our test kind of video to edit to see if we can, make the Christmas Evensong work out. Anyway, so we're going to give that a try, and we'll get that up on YouTube pretty soon. So God bless, and keep on tuning in to all of our different services and things, and we will see you soon, okay? Blessings. Just a quick reminder before we go, though. Remember, Christmas Eve, we're having drive-by Eucharist at 3:30 p.m. In other words, we'll have the Eucharist at 3:30 streamed on Facebook Live, and then we will be distributing the sacrament on the grounds, or basically in the parking lot of the parish, until about 5 o'clock or something like that. And then we will have our Christmas evensong offering that will be put up later on in that evening for Christmas Eve. And that will feature our youth doing music, a prayer service with mainly featuring our kids. So anyway, we're looking forward to that. So God bless and
Everyone stay safe.
have a blessed Advent.